Some have claimed that the accounts of creation in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, are incompatible with the scientific theories of the origin of life, such as the Big Bang or evolution. Before we deal with that point directly in the next video, we have to start by thinking a bit about how we understand the book of Genesis itself. One important question to ask is, what would the original hearers of the book of Genesis have understood its message to be? They weren't modern scientists, remember. They were the unschooled inhabitants of the ancient Middle East. And so we will get in trouble if we bring our modern scientific questions and ask them of Genesis, because the original authors weren't writing to answer those questions. I would suggest that the book of Genesis is not about the scientific details of how God created the universe. In fact, God doesn't correct our science anywhere in the Bible. Instead, the beginning of Genesis is about why God created, His purposes for the world, and His relationship to it. And the book of Genesis communicates this to the original hearers in their own original culture, language, and ideas. So the book of Genesis needs to be read in its original context, the world of the ancient Jews, Mesopotamians, and Egyptians. And read in that context, the beginning of Genesis is a bit like a parody film, like the kind that takes a well-known style of film or plotline and twists it to be funny or make a point. A bit like how Shaun of the Dead mocks zombie films, or how Johnny English mocks James Bond films. So the beginning of Genesis takes the well-known ideas of creation in the surrounding cultures and twists them to take a dig at them and make a point. So if we'd asked the original hearers of Genesis what points they thought Genesis was making, they would have said things like, "Wow, there's only one God in this story, rather than the many gods of those other stories. And wow, this God is totally all-powerful over creation, unlike in the other stories where the gods are kind of part of creation. And wow, this God really loves and cares for human beings, unlike in the other stories where the gods made human beings to be their slaves and servants." Those are the kind of points that would have struck the original hearers, not the scientific details. One consequence of this is that we should be careful about reading the creation accounts in Genesis too literally. In fact, Christian thinkers have been warning about this since very early on. As early as the 3rd century AD, a Christian thinker called Origen pointed to clues in the Genesis story that it shouldn't be read as a literal creation account. For example, the first 3 days all have morning and evening, yet the sun and moon are only created on the 4th day. And in the 16th century, a well-respected Bible scholar, John Calvin, said of Genesis, "He who wants to learn astronomy and other recondite arts, let him go elsewhere." In other words, if you want to learn science, you're not going to learn it from Genesis. These guys saw the clues in the stories themselves, way before modern science challenged a literal interpretation of Genesis. That the beginning of Genesis is not about the scientific details of the universe, but about God's relationship with it and with humankind.